Although I grew up in the city of Omaha, there were still pockets of agrarian culture, and a half a block from our house were cornfields, railroad tracks, and the Snell Sash and Door Company, where there were forts of wooden pallets and where empty, wonderfully available railway boxcars waited for their freight. All these were ideal hangouts for boys. We dug foxholes and patrolled for Nazis like the characters in Combat, ate wild mulberries and sunflower seeds, clambered all over those boxcars, and had our pennies flattened by the rails, on the rails by passing locomotives. Once a railroad detective caught us and sent my father a stern letter warning of the mortal dangers of doing what we were doing. My father tried to reprimand us, but we could tell his heart wasn't really in it. Railroad tracks, he knew, were just so neat. But gradually we boys got to an age when that make-believe world seemed like kid stuff, even unmanly. And it was about then that a nun at Holy Angels assigned us the written homework of an essay on the crucifixion. I instinctively realized I didn't want to analyze it or quote sources on it. I wanted to write about the crucifixion as if I were actually there on Golgotha, and I had the temerity to raise my hand and ask if that was possible. Sister Pierce seemed confused at first, but since I was the only kid who'd requested to write fiction instead of an essay, she didn't think it would be a problem. I produced a short story very much like Ernest Hemingway's very bad short play, Today is Friday, which I hadn't yet read, about Roman soldiers who witnessed Jesus dying on the cross and speaking about it over grappa later on. Hemingway has a Roman soldier say in his playlet, "I tell you, he was pretty good in there today," and my own version was possibly just as bad. But I had discovered a way to indulge a desire that seemed peculiar only to me, the desire to make things up, essentially to improve on the life I had experienced either through reading or being knocked about as we all are. It is a kind of line, for the good of the characters, for the good of the audience. In writing about his own poems in his book of essays, The Glass Anvil, Andrew Hudgens mentions the quandary poets and fiction writers face in making things up. "I'm always astonished," he writes, "at how falsely I remember things, astonished at how plastic memory is. And even when I know a memory is incorrect, part of my brain cleaves to the wrong imagined memory. And now I hold two images in my head, two memories, and the false one is more vivid and more emotionally significant to me than the actual one. Which then is the truest memory? It's convenient when the actual events adequately convey the emotional experience, but sometimes they don't, and the writer has to choose. Often the choice devolves to which version provides the juicier words, for crucial to the urge to write is an interest in the English language that for me probably had its roots in the secret language of Rob and I as we shared as twins. Etymologies fascinated me, and one of my grander moments in high school occurred when in my illicit reading, a book open on my knees but hidden from out of the view of the teacher, I fell upon the word onomatopoeia, which is defined as the formation of a word by imitation of the sound to which it refers, such as bang, boom, and cuckoo. I couldn't remember ever having seen such a strange word before, so I puzzled over it for a while. The next thing I knew, the English teacher in my Jesuit high school, a layman in his 20s named Mr. Schaefer, was giving us our difficult weekend reading assignment. A classmate, Mickey Deasing, complained that the weather was going to be beautiful and the homework hard. Couldn't Mr. Schaefer let us off just this once? And the sporty teacher negotiated a deal with us. Our class could pick one person, and the teacher could pick a word. If the student could spell it, we'd have no homework for the weekend. You probably see where this is heading. To my surprise and trepidation, the class picked me, chanting, "Hansen, Hansen." And so I became the chosen one. And Mr. Schaefer, already clearly complacent about his victory, chose the most difficult word he knew. "All right, Mr. Hansen," he said, "spell onomatopoeia." I couldn't believe the luck. And when I correctly spelled the word out, Mr. Schaefer loudly cussed in his frustration, and my high school classroom erupted in wild hoots and cheers. A measure of how miraculous that seemed to one classmate is that he recorded the anecdote in a book of favorite memories of our 30th class reunion. High school began for me just after the closing of the Second Vatican Council, and in our religion classes we became acquainted with the Council's new conception that our primary liturgical celebration was located at two tables. The dinner table of bread and wine, of course, but also the table of the food of written and spoken word, with both tables united by Christ, the Word incarnate. Words were sanctified for their healing, nurturing, blessing, challenging, and gathering power. And homilies began to draw upon fiction, theater, and film as additional resources in guiding us toward holiness and the love of God and others. Writing itself, at least for me, was given the lofty stature of priesthood as another way of imitating Christ. I have had the good fortune to be handsomely rewarded for my writing, and yet I'm certain I would continue making things up, even if I were like Emily Dickinson or Franz Kafka or Gerard Manley Hopkins, writing only for an audience of a few choice friends. There is a joy in the simple making of things, for creativity, as Ignatius of Loyola pointed out, is a participation in the divine. But I think there's something else going on. As you may know, in his spiritual exercises, St. Ignatius invented a helpful method for meditating on Scripture and drawing profit from it. Each hour's meditation is done in the same way. We begin with a preparatory prayer, and as a prelude to the meditation, consider the history of the subject, such as Jesus appearing to 7 of his disciples as they fished, reading the gospel passage several times until we can develop a mental representation of the locale and the people in it. We then ask for a grace, in this case to be consoled at seeing Christ on the shore and to feel the joy and comfort of his resurrection. We see the fishermen hauling in their nets on the Sea of Galilee, hear the smack of waves against the boat's hull, feel the sunshine on our skins, smell seaweed and mackerel, taste the water we scoop up in our palm. With all 5 senses wholly engaged, we can be as shocked and happy as Peter was when he recognized that it was the risen Christ who was roasting a fish on the shore and plunged into the sea to wade to him. We hear Christ's instruction to Peter, and we also enter the conversation, or as Ignatius puts it, colloquy, inquiring perhaps on how we ourselves can feed a sheep, or just saying like Peter, "Lord, you know that I love you." We finish the meditation period with a standard prayer such as the Our Father, and usually exercitants keep a journal in which they describe what happened in their prayer and its effect on them. But for me and many others I have guided as a counselor is when we go beyond what is written in a biblical scene and freely imagine other conversations or activities within the location of the story, that we have a fuller sense of God's love for us and his concern over the most humdrum events in our lives. The job we're seeking, the sinful temptations that persecute us, the strains and worries we all share. So it is when I'm making things up and putting them down on the page. A subject first mysteriously presents itself to me as one I need to deal with, a story I have to tell. One by one, fictional scenes occur to me like many stair steps to upper rooms. Seeing, hearing, and feeling the locale, the weather, and the characters enables me to become a participant in each scene, and no matter the topic, my own emotional, psychological, or spiritual concerns are highlighted or weeded out. I solve issues not in the random, chaotic way of dreaming, but through orderly focus and conjecture. A like experience happens when we read. For whether we're aware of it or not, we're making things up just as the author is, putting faces on those who have not been described, filling in the details left out, questioning what we would do in those circumstances, or recalling times when we were vexed in just that way. The Irish novelist John McGahern once said that religious liturgies were his first book. What he meant was the theater of the rites and the spare poetry of the spoken texts excited his imagination just as a children's book does, but without the nonsense rhymes and feel-good notions that well-meaning parents and educators sometimes insist upon. I had visited some 12-step meetings with friends and have been struck by the earthy, frank, hair-raising, and sometimes hilarious reminiscences of men and women who are coming to terms with their alcoholism. The confessions are ways of repenting for a history of excesses, establishing transparency, reforming one's own life but connecting it with others while disconnecting it from the past and sharing in the sheer gift of recovery. Hearing those acts of reconciliation has always reminded me of Garrison Keillor's insistence on the obligation we all have to tell stories. We sit around a kitchen table or huddle over cups of coffee or queue up for a movie ticket, and as we confess or joke or prevaricate with each other, we may think we are just killing time, but we are forming a kind of church. There are grander things we can now aspire to, magnificent projects we can take on. But it is the holiness of the ordinary that is, I think, what the writers of the 21st century are called to notice and seek out.